Hello and welcome to The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, Tate Britain's show of historic women artists, the Dear Art Foundation at 50, and a record-breaking auction result for Martin Wong. I take a tour of Tate Britain's new exhibition, Now You See Us, featuring more than 100 women artists working between the 16th and 20th centuries with Tabitha Barber, its curator. The Dear Art Foundation has reached its half-century, and its director, Jessica Morgan, tells us about how it's changed in that time, and especially how it's radically expanded the range of artists it shows and collects. We also discuss the new commission at Dear Beacon by Steve McQueen. And this episode's Work of the Week is one of the few record-breaking paintings in a relatively middling auction week in New York. Martin Wong's portrait of Mikey Piñero at Ridge Street and Stanton from 1985, which sold for more than $1.6 million on Tuesday evening at Christie's. Barry Blinderman, who sold the work in 1985 from his Semaphore gallery in New York, tells us more about the painting and the extraordinary circumstances of its making. Would you like to share your views on the art newspaper and help shape its future? If so, do complete our reader survey at theartnewspaper.com, where you can also subscribe. And do also subscribe to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. Please also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, on Thursday, Tate Britain opened a groundbreaking show, Now You See Us, Women Artists in Britain 1520 to 1920. It features more than 100 women who forged public careers as artists, from miniaturists in the court of Henry VIII to modernists emerging from the Slade School of Art in the 20th century. It shows that across these 400 years, women were widely shown in the art world in Britain before many of them fell into obscurity and were erased from mainstream art histories. I went to Tate Britain to discover more with the exhibition's co-curator, Tabitha Barber. Tabitha, one of the things that your introduction to the catalogue makes very clear is that even now, putting together a show like this is an art historical challenge. And there's a point where you point out the fact that even some basic foundational material on certain artists is still hard to come by. Nevertheless, this is a show which is built on recent decades of extraordinary art historical detective work and so on. And it must feel tremendous, actually, to be in the exhibition at last. I know a lot of work has gone into this.
Well, it actually seems quite remarkable. I think a year and a half ago, we could only imagine this space. So the fact that it's all come together and we have 238 works by 110 women on show is quite remarkable. And I say 110, which seems an awful lot, but actually there are so many artists that we could have had and don't represent, so many artists' careers that it's just been impossible to unravel and put together and locate their works. So some women, although they were well known in their day, just simply aren't represented.
Right. And so, in a way, this is a challenge to those budding art historians out there who need a project to go and find out more about lots and lots of these women that are not represented here, actually.
Well, you say that, but in 1971, Linda Nochlin said the same thing.
Exactly.
And over 50 years later, here we are still. Although I do think that suddenly the wind seems to have changed, and there does seem to be a very determined focus on women artists. That's another thing that we've been grappling with this exhibition, the sheer extraordinary interest all around the world. There are so many competing exhibitions, and as fast as we could identify the works, they're being sold at auction or nabbed for other exhibitions.
The challenge, if you like, of attribution and so on is really made clear in the very first works in the show, really, which are these miniatures.
Yes.
Tell us about these, because these could be by women, but you cannot be certain, is that right?
They could be, and in fact we say we start in 1520 because our intention was to start with Susanna Hornbout. But we have no work by Susanna Hornbout in the show. So I think that in itself is an illustration of the problem. The artist who we do start with is Lavina Teerlink. Both Hornbout and Teerlink, we know, worked at the court of Henry VIII. Teerlink stayed in England longer. She died, but she worked for successive monarchs right up until Elizabeth I. And we have 5 works in the show which are attributed to her. We're very careful not to give the full attribution because just that little last bit of evidence is lacking. Back in the 1980s, Roy Strong did an exhibition at the V&A and he grouped together miniatures which he attributed to Lavina Teerlink. And since then, they've been hugely contested by so many art historians. And it's all by attribution, trying to match up miniatures with documentation. Sometimes it's impossible. So what we have on show are those miniatures that Roy Strong had in 1984, one extra, which is a new attribution, something that came up at auction. And all we can say is that with technical analysis that's recently gone on, what we can say is that all the miniatures made between the death of Holbein and the first fully attributed work by Hilliard, all those miniatures can't all be by Lavinia Teerlinck. And they've been analysed, and some have been dismissed because they are by different hands. But the ones on show we can definitely say are probably by the same artist. But is that artist Teerlinck? That's the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle, right, which is lacking.
And is it right that lots of people are trying to prove this, and there's all sorts of work being done? There's lots of discussion online, even, and so on.
You can read blog posts and so much material online on both Hornbout and Teerlinck. And on the one hand, it's gratifying to know that so many people are interested in these artists, especially, trying to find women's agency at the Tudor court. It's exciting, but sometimes that excitement pushes over the limits of what the documentation tells you. So I would be very cautious about keeping to the attributions that are made online. These are the ones that we think really may have a chance of being by her. But all the other attributions to illuminated manuscripts that are based on the sort of slight curl on the top of a capital H, I think it's, yes.
It's really fascinating. And in this same space with them, rather wonderfully, you've got an artist to whom you can make very firm attributions, who has become a kind of superstar of that process that you were talking
yes.
about, that explosion of interest in women artists.
Yes.
And it's Artemisia Gentileschi.
It is Artemisia Gentileschi.
You've got two works by her.
We do. In fact, when you come into the show, you're hit, first of all, by an Angelica Kaufmann, one of her ceiling paintings from the Royal Academy, which is a personification of a woman in the creative act. And you can look to one side and see Artemisia Gentileschi doing precisely the same thing in her, what's always called a self-portrait, as the allegory of painting. Whether it actually is a self-portrait, of course, is contested, but what we do know is that she's probably using her own image to create the allegory of painting. And of course, she's doing what no other man can do, because the personification of painting is always female. So when you look at this picture and see this figure in contemporary dress wearing an apron, hard at work, you can't help but make the equation with Artemisia herself.
Of course. And then there's also a classic subject of hers, which is Susanna and the Elders. She painted this several times.
She painted Susanna and the Elders throughout her career. Her earliest work is Susanna and the Elders. And I think the idea is that Susanna is this exemplar of a virtuous woman. And in fact, this work is another work which represents her London period, which until now was only represented by the self-portrait as the allegory of painting. This is a completely new discovery that was made by the Royal Collection, a picture that was in the Royal Collection, but was catalogued as French school 17th century.
Oh,
it was filthy dirty, the canvas was extended, and they spent 5 years restoring it. And they've displayed it at Windsor just before it came to us, but we're the first public institution to show it.
How amazing. And of course, one of the things about these two works being in the Royal Collection, lent by His Majesty the King, of course, is that she was in the Royal Court. She came to London and was into the court of Charles I. So it shows that, as well as artists who have been unjustly kept away from the spotlight, she was in the spotlight. She was an artist of some reputation when she arrived in London.
She was a famous celebrity, and she knew that. She wrote a series of letters to a patron in the 1640s, and she's unwittingly written a whole load of sound bites that people do mine. And one of her comments was, "I'll paint you my self-portrait. You can hang it in your gallery as all the princes in Europe do." Yeah. So she was very sure of herself and very sure that her reputation came with her celebrity because she was a woman, because it was so rare for a woman to conduct a public career in the way that she did. I think actually, though, what has happened to Artemisia over the centuries is really interesting, because she was so well known in her day. But very early after her death, the first fledgling art histories that were being written in Britain, instead of talking about her art, people start talking about her love life. And this rather overtakes the notion and sense of Artemisia that she was profligate.
And it somehow taps into a whole history then of biographical art history relating to women, which you touch on through the show.
Yes, and I think so many of the artists in this show, the ones that do have Wikipedia pages, those entries aren't illustrated by works by the women. They're illustrated by images of the women by male artists.
Right, really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's go and look at Mary Beale. She's an artist who was extraordinarily prolific, and you've got some wonderful works by her here. There's a self-portrait here to our left, but there's also this wonderful portrait actually in the Tate collection, which is of Anne Sotheby. Tell us about this, because again, she's an artist who, it seems to me, was deeply accomplished, but what kind of fame did she have compared to Artemisia?
This portrait is actually a brand new acquisition. This is the first time that we've shown it. And we do have other Mary Beales in the collection. Our first one was acquired back in 1992, and we've been steadily collecting Mary Beale ever since. But this is the first painting by her that represents her professional career. Because before, we have sketches of her son, a portrait of her husband. They're lovely and beautiful, but when we make the case for Mary Beale being the most important professional artist working in this country, British woman artist, we had to have something that represented her professional activity. What's interesting about Mary Beale is the change that has gone on over the centuries in how she's talked about. In her day, people writing in her day, and in the late 17th century, in the early 18th century, people were very complimentary about her. Walpole was extremely complimentary about her. But I think it's very interesting to take a look at the 19th century additional notes to the new volume of Walpole, and suddenly you have hesitation creeping in. She's dull, and she's a copyist, and she's derivative, and she just makes works copied after Lely, and she has no sense of character.
How interesting.
And it said that really she should be judged alongside women artists, not artists.
And it's often the case that it's the latter-day art histories that make these corrections to the existing record, and particularly in the 20th century is another thing.
I think it is that we've been trying to pinpoint just when it is that these women lose their reputations, because there isn't a single artist in this exhibition who didn't have a reputation and who wasn't known in their day. They were all known as artists and had professional public careers, or most of them. But it's in the 20th century, I think. It starts in the 19th century when the way you talk about a woman artist, you can't take gender out of the way women are discussed. And some of the gallant language that's used about women artists, it's just comical now. It's this inherited notion that women are amateurs rather than professionals, and as amateurs, their art is therefore less good, so they aren't the subject of proper study.
Right. And we're going to come to a painting now, which is really indicative again of that art historical search, and looking at an artist who has just one work that you can actually attribute to them, and this is Mary Grace. Tell us about Mary, and and more about why it is that only one extant work is able to be included.
Well, I wish I could tell you more about Mary Grace than is known. I mean, in fact, not very much is known about her. She must have had a career earlier than the 1760s because of her age, but it's only from the 1760s that we really have any information about her, because 1760 is the date of the first public art exhibition in this country, and we're displaying her portrait in a room looking at the public exhibition careers of women, because I think it might be surprising for people to really understand that women have always been part of public exhibitions, and Mary Grace included, not at the Royal Academy, but at the Society of Artists. In fact, she was an honorary member of the Society of Artists. She was made that in 1769. And you can look through the exhibition catalogues and see that she was a constant, regular exhibitor, not just one work per year, but several works per year, not just portraits, but genre works, mythologies, etc. And those works are completely lost. And I think with a career such as hers, how do you begin to piece it together? How do you begin to identify those works when you have simply nothing to compare them with in order to make attributions?
It's amazing. Do you think it's possible that they are somewhere in country houses or in minor museums, stores or whatever?
I think they must be, and they're attributed to someone else. I mean, there's a plaque on this picture, and because it's her self-portrait and she's sitting there with her palette, she's obviously an artist, and so people think, oh, woman artist, she must be Angelica Kaufman. So
it's clearly not Angelica Kaufman.
Clearly not Angelica Kaufman. And further on the wall, we have a portrait by Catherine Reed, and that plaque on the frame says Ramsay, because people thought it was by Alan Ramsay.
Right. How interesting. So that just devils the whole endeavour of trying to attribute works to women. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Next to this Mary Grace, is a painting by Mary Black of Messenger Monsey, and this is from a similar period, 1760s, but this is notable for another reason.
It's notable for another reason. Mary Black was the daughter of a minor artist, Thomas Black, who was a drapery painter, and she is thought to have trained or had some training with Ramsay, and may have worked in his studio making copies after his work, the endless copies of portraits of George III that were required. But this is a commission from Messenger Monzi, who was a doctor. And what's extraordinary about this picture is the series of letters that exist between the sitter and his cousin, who had also commissioned a portrait, and they also commissioned copies of their portraits so they could exchange them and each have two. The letters are interesting because of the contentious nature of payment. When Mary Black says she's not going to charge the same as Joshua Reynolds, that would be stupid, but he charged £50, so she thought that maybe she'd charge half, £25. And he's absolutely affronted by this and writes to his cousin saying she's charging £25. If this gets out, her reputation is going to be ruined. I was expecting to give her 5 guineas. And they end up calling her a slut for asking for money and calling her saucy. Oh, so I think it's this sort of constant navigation women artists have to make between behaving as was expected of a woman, which is looking towards the home and domestic life and living a virtuous private life, being ladylike and a gentlewoman, and having to, if you're an artist, having to earn money, a commercial living.
Now, we're standing in front of a painting here which is remarkable in the sense that, as well as women's attitude to their professional work being questioned, their attitude towards certain subject matter was being questioned to a certain degree, in the sense that women were expected to paint certain things but not others. Tell us about the painting we're standing in front of.
We're standing in front of Elizabeth Butler, although she was then Elizabeth Thompson, so it's before her marriage. Elizabeth Thompson, Lady Butler's famous painting, The Roll Call, which she exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1874. And I think of all the works in the exhibition, this was the most famous. It was an absolute sensational knockout hit at the Royal Academy exhibition. Crowds came to see it. There was a police guard put next to it, not because they thought that the crowds would damage this painting, but all the bustles and parasols might damage the works by Leighton hanging around it. But Queen Victoria demanded that it be moved from the exhibition to Buckingham Palace so she could view it, and she purchased it. It had actually already been purchased by a sort of northern industrialist, but she wrestled it from him.
How amazing.
And the copyright for the reproduction rights of the work sold for a whopping £1,400. So it was an absolutely famous work. The reviews of the painting were amazing. One review said, "We will now look out for Elizabeth Butler at forthcoming exhibitions because she's a name to be reckoned with." John Ruskin, I don't think we mentioned it in the label, but I think by the time we'd got to this painting, we'd become a bit jaded by Ruskin's opinions. He had a lot to say about women artists, and not all of it complimentary. But it was this work and the work that she showed at the Royal Academy the following year that he said changed his mind about women artists. He said, "I've been on record saying that no woman artist can paint, and actually I've changed my mind."
Right. But by taking on a battle scene, she
Yes.
was doing something that was unexpected, if you like.
She was doing
of women.
something that was totally unexpected of women, because painting heroic battle was at the top of the hierarchy of genres. It was not regarded something that women should do. Hanging next to this work is a history painting by Henrietta Ward, who before Elizabeth Butler was probably the most famous, most known woman artist working in the country. And it's on a small scale, it's sentimental, it's based on Agnes Strickland's Lives of the Queens of England.
Right.
And it was really well regarded, and it was a work that some critics used to argue for women to be made Royal Academy members. But it was thought to be wonderful because of the sentiment that she was able to convey.
So Elizabeth Butler's statement then in making a
Yes.
battle scene and making a
Yes.
history painting
Yes.
was really quite something.
Exactly.
But also, I guess, it's important to stress, yes, she showed it at the Royal Academy, but she wasn't able to become a member of the Royal Academy at the time.
No, in fact, in this display case over here, we have the election record of her nomination and her attempted election, and she led the voting rounds, but in the last round, I think people conspired to keep the woman out, and she lost out by
Right.
2 votes.
Now, opposite Butler's painting is a work by Lucy Kemp Welch, which is actually really important because this is where the Tate gets involved, and this is the first work by a woman, or one of the first works by a woman, that enters the Tate collection.
Yes, it was another knockout hit at the Royal Academy in 1897 by the artist Lucy Kemp Welch. It's a really large painting, and it's of these wild horses, and the composition sort of shows the horses charging towards you. So it's a very impactful picture, and it was regarded as extraordinary. But again, we were talking about the language that critics use, this sort of gallant language, expecting to find in women's work the virtues that women themselves should possess. So everything's either charming or gentle, etc. And this one was surprisingly good for a young woman.
And so when does it come into the Tate collection?
It was actually purchased by the Chantry bequest. And so the fund of money given to the nation by Sir Francis Chantry to purchase every year works to pass into the National Collection. It was administered by the Royal Academy, and they tended at the beginning to purchase works that had been shown at the Royal Academy. And this was their pick from the Royal Academy summer exhibition in 1897. So this, along with the slightly earlier Love Locked Out by Anna Lee Merritt, are the first works by women to enter the Tate collection.
One of the things that's really clear from the show is that there's a lot of pacing in terms of scale. So we've come from Kent Welch's picture, which is really quite a large picture, to a watercolour in the neighbouring room. Why is this significant?
Well, in this room, we follow the careers of women who were dedicated to watercolour. And we also take time to dwell on the foundation of the Society of Female Artists, which came about because although watercolour was deemed the appropriate genre for women to pursue, and most women did, there was nowhere for them to exhibit their work.
Right.
Because if you were not a member of one of the professional watercolour societies, you couldn't exhibit your work with them, and they restricted their lady members. So in this room, we follow the careers of some women who were members of those watercolour societies, but also others who pursued watercolour with a dedicated intent and exhibited elsewhere, sometimes mounting their own exhibitions.
Right, and Barbara Bodichon is an example of a kind of artist who worked. I mean, this is a fully worked up watercolour, it's not just a sketch.
We have 3 works that were exhibited. Throughout the exhibition, we're trying to focus on works that we know were exhibited and were critically reviewed. The 3 works we have by her in the show we know were exhibited, and she was actually, I think, we say, and maybe I'm wrong, someone challenged me on this, we say that she was the first British woman to have a solo show, which was at the French Gallery in 1859. So if anyone has further information. But I think the size, and that despite the fact that the watercolour landscape, we're not talking about picturesque views of the Lake District. No. These are absolutely amazing panoramic views of Algeria. Her husband was French-Algerian, so she spent half the year in Algeria and half in Britain. But Bodichon is really an important pivotal figure in the exhibition. Not simply because of her art, but because she was also a champion of women's rights. Right, and you have a portrait of her and some of the documentation in relation to the formation of that society. We have a portrait of her, which comes from Girton College in Cambridge, which she co-founded. Right. And it's painted by Emily Osborne, and she's part of a group of artists who you could say were proto-feminists, and they argued and wrote and painted in the cause of women, particularly women's right to pursue professional careers and for women to have a university education. Right. Barbara Bodichon is usually credited with, may not be the case, but she certainly signed it, the first petition to the Royal Academy for women to be admitted to the Royal Academy schools, because access to training is also one of the themes that runs throughout this show. Right, there's a whole series of services, resources which are denied to women throughout the history of art, basically. They cannot attend life classes, they cannot join academies and so on. Yeah, they have to copy works, paint copies from National Gallery works. Even when they are admitted to the Royal Academy schools, they don't have access to life drawing classes because it's regarded as improper. Right. So also what we have in the exhibition are 2 petitions signed by women RA students and signed by the leading women artists of the day. It's part of their decades-long campaign to be admitted to life drawing classes. They were only admitted in 1893, and it was very contested territory. The notion of a woman being confronted by a nude model was beyond the comprehension. Indeed. So lastly, we're going to look at Gwen John, and I think Gwen John is a really interesting figure in all of this, apart from anything else. She had a brother who was more famous than her during her lifetime, I guess, in Augustus John. But she was right at the heart of Paris, for instance. She was an extraordinarily well-connected artist and working with amazing artists and poets and so on. And she now is far better known than Augustus, I would say. Possibly, but certainly not at the time. And she's one of a big cohort of artists at the Slade in the 1890s when Augustus John said it was the great age of female students at the Slade. And we thought it would be interesting in the exhibition to try and identify those artists, maybe try and have some of their work in the previous room we've been in, which is looking at women in art school, and follow their careers into the 20th century. And it became such a difficult research task. You find that although women who outnumbered men at the Slade by quite a considerable margin, and they won major prizes at the Slade, their careers just fall off a cliff, and it becomes impossible to trace them. Gwen John, of course, is an exception, but we were interested in looking at women artists coming out of the Slade who, like their male peers, exhibited at the New English Art Club, but unlike their male peers who were almost immediately made members, the women had to wait. And I don't think Gwen John ever made it to membership status. She went to Paris instead.
She did, and there met Rodin and Rilke and so many others.
Exactly.
And in the show, you've got these two wonderful portraits, one of Chloe Boughton Lee, and of course the wonderful self-portrait.
Yes.
And it's the poster image for the show.
It is the poster.
On. It's such a meaningful work, isn't it, in terms of that sort of confidence, that power that this image now has, and what it tells us about this extraordinary artist.
I think she's looking at you, challenging you to recognise her. And that's why we used her for the poster. It's challenging you to come and see all these women artists alongside her. There's a quiet determination about her look.
Now you see us indeed. Tabitha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now You See Us, Women Artists in Britain, 1520 to 1920, is at Tate Britain in London until the 13th of October. And you can hear our conversation about the Royal Academy in London's exhibition of Angelica Kauffman, who's a key figure in the Tate Show, in the episode of this podcast from the 1st of March. The Kauffman Show continues until the 30th of June. Coming up, Dia is 50 and Martin Wong's portrait of Mikey Piñero. That's after this week's news bulletin. A new portrait of Charles III by the artist Jonathan Yeo was unveiled on Tuesday. It shows Charles bathed in red, wearing the uniform of the Welsh Guards, sword in hand, with an eco-friendly butterfly landing on his shoulder. According to the BBC, Queen Camilla is said to have looked at the painting and told Yeo, "Yes, you've got him." Yeo explains on his website that the vivid colour of the glazes in the background echo the uniform's bright red tunic, not only resonating with the royal heritage found in many historical portraits, but also injecting a dynamic, contemporary jolt into the genre with its uniformly powerful hue. But critics have taken a dim view of the work. The Guardian's Jonathan Jones described it as a right royal banality. The painting is on view at the Philip Moll Gallery in London until the 14th of June. A US geologist says she has cracked one of art history's biggest mysteries, the location in which Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa is set. Anne Pizzorusso, who says online that she's worked in oil drilling and gem hunting, believes the landscape is in the northern Italian city of Lecco. Pizzorusso matched Leonardo's bridge, the mountain range and the lake in the Mona Lisa to Lecco's 14th century Azzone Visconti bridge, the Alps overlooking the area, and Lake Garlate, which Leonardo is known to have visited 500 years ago. But art historians are sceptical of the proposal. Francesca Fiorani, Commonwealth Professor of Art History at the University of Virginia, said that while Leonardo studied nature, mountains, rivers and rocks with an incredibly keen eye, the landscapes of his paintings are his personal imaginary rendition of nature, not copies of actual landscapes. The theft of a 3,000-year-old gold torque and bracelet from a UK institution has sparked calls for greater government support for the museum sector. Police are yet to make arrests and are appealing for information to track down two thieves who broke into the Ely Museum in Cambridgeshire on the 7th of May and escaped on electric scooters. With gold prices hitting a record high in recent months, experts are worried that the precious artefacts, worth £220,000 in their current form, might be melted down for their scrap metal value, although experts suggest that the process of melting them would not be straightforward given their composition. Matthew Pope, an associate professor at University College London's Institute of Archaeology, says the incident should be a wake-up call about a lack of investment in the museum sector after 14 years of austerity-driven underfunding. You can read all these stories and much more on the website or the app. Now, 50 years ago, the Dia Art Foundation was founded in New York. The three people behind the organisation were Faria Friedrich, then Philippa de Menil, Heine Friedrich and Helen Winkler-Fosdick, and they intended it to, in their words, plan, realise and maintain public projects which cannot be easily produced, financed or owned by individual collectors because of their cost and magnitude. The institution is perhaps best known for managing permanent works by individual artists, including Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty and Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnel in Utah, Walter de Maria's Earth Room in New York and Lightning Field in New Mexico, and Dia Bridgehampton, the former fire station and church where Dan Flavin installed a permanent installation of his fluorescent light pieces. But over the decades, Dia has achieved much more besides, and in the years since 2015, especially when Jessica Morgan took over as director, it's diversified its programme and consolidated its collection and exhibition spaces in Chelsea in New York City and Beacon in upstate New York. To mark the anniversary, Dia's commissioned a new work called Base by the British artist Steve McQueen, an installation in light and sound which appears abstract but makes reference to the Middle Passage through which enslaved people would be forced to cross the Atlantic to the Americas. I spoke to Jessica Morgan about the anniversary and McQueen's work. Jessica, Dia is 50. How would you assess where it is in its 50th year? Is it the organisation you want it to be? And you've been there for, 9 years now. So have you shaped the organisation to where you want it to be?
Well, we've been in a period of reinvigoration, I'd say, now for some years. And when I say we, I very much include incredible program team here who've been on that journey with me. Many of the people that I've worked with over those years either started with me or have started recently. And we inherited an institution with a very clear mission, but that perhaps had just become somewhat faded over the years. And I think that was frankly largely down to fairly minimal programming. Ultimately, I think Dia had remained very much true to what it stood for. And I would say time is at the center of that. We have permanent artworks installed that are under our care. The shortest exhibition we do is about a year. And the kind of long-term commitment to working with artists. Once we begin to work with an artist, it's really something that we consistently return to year on year. Mm-hmm. But yes, I think we've just had a very focused period of growing the collection. We collect to exhibit, so sometimes it's hard to differentiate really between major acquisitions of bodies of work and the displays that result from them. And reinvigorated the commissioning program, which of course, in a way was really the beginning of Dia, was working with artists to realize extraordinary projects. So I think we'd all agree that we inherited an incredible institution that had been kept sort of remarkably true to itself and its direction, but that needed more.
Yeah, right, absolutely. I guess one of the key things about that more is more variety, more diversity among the artists in the collection, because though there was an extremely august collection and the extraordinary sites that were commissioned and looked after over all these years, it was a relatively narrow band of artists that were in the collection and so on. So that seems to me to have been one of the key factors that you've changed over the years.
Absolutely. We could not have been more of a dead white male institution. We had a long way to go and we've been fighting that battle uphill. I think what was incredible about that really was beginning conversations with artists that we continue to this day with folks who were exhibiting alongside the people who were part of Dia. Sam Gilliam wanted to be part of Dia because Donald Judd was his favorite artist. Also, surprises like that through conversations. But yes, it was a very deliberate effort to bring into our midst artists who, were rightfully part of that history, who, as we know, get written out for all kinds of reasons, lack of representation, the fact that nobody was paying attention to artists of color for so many years. But in essence, actually, really, when we're talking about the 60s and 70s focus of our collection, which of course is a very substantial part of what we do, it was about restoring history and then beginning to look more globally. Dia's founding origins were sort of based in Europe, and by that actually really I mean Germany and the US. And at this point, we now have a very significant focus on Asia, of course, a place where during this period of the 60s and 70s, there's also, immense experimentation happening. Latin America is really a big focus for us now in the present and future years. I'm really beginning to think about if we're really known as an institution that has a focus on this period, we need to do a much better job of really representing that. And that is all said knowing that we're still a very focused institution. There are still a little more than 70 artists in our collection.
Right.
You know, we work with a few people and we go very deep into their work and their careers.
Right. And one of the interesting things about what you're doing, you're talking about time being such a crucial factor, is that someone like Sam Gilliam said, I think he told the New York Times not long ago, that it was one of the great moments of his life when he saw his rooms at Dia. And one of the factors was that it was about that time. It was about the amount of time that could be spent with the works, which is more akin to the kind of time that an artist spends with their own works than in many visitor experiences in museums across the world and so on, or in gallery shows especially. So that seems to me to be absolutely crucial. It's about developing relationships with works, and that's what Dia can do.
That's absolutely right, Ben. And I think it often surprises us too. You know, we bring a new body of work in, let's say Senga Ngudi and you know, the relationship between Senga and Joan Jonas, two artists who were not close with each other, but had an incredible conversation through their thinking, their conceptualization of their work, obviously their dedication to performance. But then, of course, you know, also having Maren Hassinger there, who's a long-term collaborator of Senga's, and being able to sort of piece together those relationships, whether they were deep and real or whether they were more to do with a spirit of the time and this kind of deeply experimental practices, which we really truly try to focus on.
Absolutely. And experimental is key in terms of that funding ethos, right? Because right from the start, it's works that were almost unimaginable that were realised and so on. And I love the fact that there's that amazing fact about Helen Winkler Fosdick, who was one of the founding three people behind it, that she moved to New Mexico basically to make sure that the Lightning Field by Walter de Maria can actually happen. And I imagine that must be a pressure too. If you're at the helm of an organisation like this, you've got to show a kind of comparable level of commitment, if not moving home and travelling into New Mexico for years. But it's about commitment, right, as well?
Absolutely, yeah. Big boots to fill. I mean, Helen is a legend. She also spent, I should say, weeks and weeks driving around the West looking for a crater for James Turrell. Rodin Crater was one of the projects that Dia supported at the beginning. But as you say, she spent literally years out at the Lightning Field, remote part of New Mexico in the Southwest, constructing that. You know, I'm so honored to work with the team that I work with because the way that they work with artists, the dedication that they bring to it is exceptional. You know, I think that is very much at the heart of what we do is this kind of unbounded commitment. We may not have the resources of our founders who had, somewhat limitless funds. That's definitely not the case anymore, but we're still the place that says yes, you know?
And also, crucially, it's not about real estate. I know that was a factor that you have mentioned in the past, that when you took over, there was an idea that, for instance, there might be a new building in New York, but you consolidated those Chelsea buildings and restored that presence in New York, which was a crucial factor. But still, even though it gave a site of permanence, it was still focused on the artist more than the building, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time before we made that decision really working with artists. A big shout out to Ronnie Horn and Zoe Leonard, especially, who gave a lot of hours to talking through that and just thinking about what are the spaces that artists want. And they were both adamant that, you know, the spaces we had, these industrial spaces, single stories, so natural light, were the ideal spots that they wanted. And, you know, that was Dia's history all along, was working in the type of spaces that artists use as their studios, which are, you know, quietly present, let's say, you know, architecture steps back, but highly practical, cement floors, you know, no fuss, no extraneous details. So it was very clear that that was the way forward. And yeah, we've spent a lot of time the last years, the things that perhaps people don't know about, terribly boring, but in fact, I spend most of my time doing, which is fixing up all of our various historic buildings to make sure that they're fully functioning for hopefully another 50 years.
Right, absolutely. Talking about the programming and about experimentation and so on, one of the things that you've done, which is absolutely clear when you look at the programming, is tap into another sort of long strain, but perhaps less known than some of the sort of installation elements or the kind of land art elements, which is performance and live art and so on. There was extraordinary things that happened in the past. There was a Merce Cunningham residency more recently, but there's been a long association with all those key figures from that amazing period of crossover between art and dance that happened in the 60s and 70s and so on. And that seems to me to be a clear contention of yours that, you know, we must continue to do this. We must have performance at the heart of it. You know, Joan Jonas, as you mentioned earlier on, but that seems very crucial.
Yes, and I would also add to that sound.
Yeah.
You know, one of our original sites was the Dream House of Lamont Young and Marion Sincila, who we so sadly just recently lost. You know, sound, of course, being intimately related to performance, whether it's actual or, you know, projected. But that was very important to me, coming back to this history and thinking about how do we continue that. And so we've had these extraordinary programs with Carl Craig, the incredible Detroit-based techno musician who made this extraordinary installation for us some years ago. Of course, Steve McQueen's project is very much in that sort of history of thinking about what is embodied sound, what is it to experience durational, environmental sound. And that history of Dear is so particular. But as you say, yes, dance was a central focus of Dear's. We had an incredible history, particularly back in the 1980s, of providing free performance space, rehearsal space for dancers. And over the years, we've really tried, again, with this kind of very singular focus. I mean, knowing that we can't be everything to everyone, but really, who are the figures that we can work with? And again, in this manner, which is about extending through times and not a one-off, but really, how do we begin to embed that into a program that will play out over many months, if not years?
And how does Dear ensure that it will keep in touch with what's happening right now in terms of, there's that thing about, I guess, that happened when it was drifting a bit before you took over, where it kind of felt like it had lost touch to a certain degree with what was happening right now, what artists' concerns were at the present moment. Is there a sort of process that you have in place which means that you are not going to miss something, that you will keep in touch and that you will program the absolute cutting edge?
We have a fantastic series that's been running for decades now called the Artists on Artists series. It's a talks program. We've also turned some of those conversations into books at this point. It's a program where we're really working with another generation, a younger generation to the generation that we often exhibit. We invite them to reflect on an artist from our past. It could be the recent past, or it could be back to the origins. And those conversations and those relationships, it's not simply a talk. Sometimes it's a performance. The artist is entirely at liberty to decide how to interpret that prompt. But those relationships have led to quite often commissions. Camille Normant gave an extraordinary talk on Max Neuhaus. Lucy Raven, a performative film installation about Walter de Maria. These are artists who now, of course, we've commissioned and worked with and now collected. Camille and Lucy are both in the collection. So that is a very important series for us in that it's a place where our curatorial team are really building relationships with the younger generation and thinking, frankly, they offer us a perspective on our history that is incredibly important for us to learn from. I mean, it can be highly critical. Both Camille and Lucy, I would say, were not addressing their forebears with entirely open arms. I mean, it was also a question of thinking about how their practice is, in some sense, working not against, but taking the concerns in a quite different direction, whether it was to do with sound or land art. So that's a very important way in which we continue to build these relationships and think about how, as an institution, we can remain true to our history, but at the same time challenge ourselves.
Let's return to Steve McQueen, the latest project. It's really interesting to me, you mentioned sound there, that sound has always been such a fundamental element of his films anyway. Anybody who's seen his installations will know how crucially the sound seems to be designed. But he's doing something which is quite different for him. It's as abstract as he's ever got to a certain degree, but underlying it is as much content as he's ever strayed into, if you like. There's as much content in this work as there is in 12 Years a Slave to a certain degree, and it's a similar theme.
Absolutely true. And I think also important to realize that, of course, the work emerges from decades of thinking and origins and all of Steve's work, but also particular projects that perhaps had the kind of kernel of this project within them. I think for many years, decades even, Steve had been thinking about this experience of a extreme chromatic light. The shadowless space that he's created in Dear Beacon was something that he'd been mulling over and contemplating, thinking about the movement of light, thinking about the science behind that. And perhaps in a way that led him to think about sound, how sound moves, how we are permeated by both the experience of the light and sound. But as you say, it is a radical departure in some sense, and yet entirely embedded in his practice over the years. I think what I find still most remarkable, and again, even though it was the result of deep thinking, we had perhaps a week of these 5 extraordinary bass musicians, Marcus Miller, who worked very closely with Steve, the incredible musician, to bring together 4 other bass players into the space in Dear Beacon. They performed entirely extemporaneously. I mean, there was no script. There was a prologue, let's say, by Steve, setting the scene, talking about what he was interested in, particularly this, horrific history of the Middle Passage and thinking about what the relationship to sound might be to that narrative. And yet no cues apart from the gestures and physical movements that Steve made, Marcus Miller's absolute brilliant interventions, but 5 musicians who'd never worked together working in this light environment in Beacon, so in the space, literally sort of playing the space, and resulted in this sort of 3+ hour recording that has had minimal intervention by Steve in post-production. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary to witness, I have to say. I don't think I've ever been present for something like that before.
I meant to ask, was there any sort of video recording made of this moment, or did Steve want to keep video off limits in that sense?
I think as a filmmaker, quite rightly, he knew that would shift the reading of the work in such a different direction. And this abstraction is so important for the piece. And that is what you feel when you're in the space now. I mean, first of all, of course, the fact that the sound was recorded in there has this sort of extraordinary resonance in the space with these 3 sets of speakers moving through the space. You have a very kind of direct relationship to sound that is a little bit hard to really put your finger on what exactly is going on, but it literally feels like the sound is sort of emanating from the space. And then this extremely intense light environment gradually shifting through the chromatic spectrum. I think we're all still struggling to put our finger on sort of what is going on in there. But all I can say is that it calls for extended viewing and listening. And that is, I mean, now that we're open to the public, of course, it's the most exciting thing is to see how people react. And really what we're seeing are people entering that space, slowing down, silence pervades, often drifting off on their own, even if they've come in a group. It's a very powerfully embodied experience.
There's a really interesting point that Steve McQueen made in an interview with Louisa Buck for the Art newspaper about the nature of time in the work and about how even though the shifting colours of the spectrum are so slow, you can still find yourself apparently suddenly confronting a colour that you didn't realise had happened. If you know what I mean. So suddenly it's yellow, even though you know that it's taking a really long time to change to yellow. So that curious relationship with time that you were talking about, there's all sort of microcosmic elements relating to time within this work, it seems to me, which makes it all the more appropriate that it is at Dear, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. And I think, we all react differently to colour, of course. I mean, we're all sensitized to different types of environments. And even during the recording, one of the musicians I remember had a terrible reaction to this intense red that is part of the spectrum. I mean, it was rushing out of the room, sort of couldn't deal with it at all. And, I have a similar feeling. There's a sort of eerie yellow, which I don't know, maybe I associate it with sort of scary car parks or something. But I mean, there's sort of very intense association with these different color environments, which I'm sure is different for each and every one of us as well.
But also there's this really strong point that Steve makes about the work, which is that it taps into the history of African-American music in particular. And the fact that this remark that Quincy Jones made to Steve about the fact that the electric bass kind of changed the history of music. And I think that's a really interesting factor because you've got 5 bassists, some on acoustic basses by the sound of it, but also some on electric bass, making this sound. And that's a sort of, again, it's tapping into a kind of historical subject matter of a different kind, a cultural history, if you like.
Exactly. And one of them being a musician from Mali playing the Ngoni, which is a sort of precursor of the instrument. I mean, he's an incredible musician. The upright bass as well is there, and then the electric bass as well. Exactly. I mean, it's a story of the way in which sound, music plays a part in the role of resistance, of storytelling, of connectivity, of course, in this journey of the Middle Passage, and the way in which music is such a profoundly connecting lineage across these vast terrains from Africa to the US to the Caribbean to South America, that there is this kind of very, again, quite abstract and yet extremely grounded story to be told through that. And the selection of musicians, of course, was quite deliberate in that respect, sort of wanting to think about this African diaspora and the way in which each of these musicians would bring a very specific history and lineage to that.
It sounds remarkable. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben.
And finally, it's time for the work of the week. It's auction week in New York, and aside from the shock of a cyber attack on Christie's website, it's been mostly underwhelming so far, in keeping with other recent auction seasons. There were some highlights for the auction houses, though, with Leonora Carrington's Les Distractions de Dagobert selling for a record $24.5 million, or $28.5 million with fees, more than double its $12 million low estimate at Sotheby's on Wednesday, and several records tumbling in Christie's contemporary sales on Tuesday. Among the latter was Martin Wong's portrait of Mikey Piñero at Ridge Street and Stanton from 1985, which sold for more than $1.6 million with fees. The work is in part a portrait of Piñero, the queer New Yorker poet and playwright who was briefly Wong's lover before he made the painting. It features transcribed lines from Piñero's famous Lower East Side poem. It was first sold in 1985 at the Semaphore Gallery in New York, whose co-founder was Barry Blinderman. I spoke to Blinderman about the picture. Barry, on Tuesday night, this painting sold for a record price for Martin Wong at auction at Christie's, but you were there right at the start of the life of this painting. So tell us about it and what happened.
The Mikey reciting is, with no exaggeration, a multifaceted, incredible work, which encompasses many, but not all, of the characteristics that we associate with Martin's work. Martin, in a sense, was a linguist, but not in a scholarly sense, but in a visual sense. And he used sign systems, ASL, American Sign Language, English, Spanish, constellations signifying portentions and fortune and the reading of astrological signs. And then there were also the whole language of bricks. We'll remember that bricks, or clay, was the first medium upon which writing was introduced in 3200 BC. So for Martin, I used to say it's not so much that he's painting the buildings, but he's building the paintings, as opposed to an impressionist or a standard way that people would portray buildings. He's doing every brick individually, savoring each one. Each one is luscious, reflecting of light. And this is a very important thing. So back to why this painting is so special, and it really is. Let me talk about where it was shown. So we showed Martin Wong 3 times, all 3 times in the fall. The first was 84, and that was in Soho at Semaphore. The second was at Semaphore East at 10th and B. The last show was the one of storefronts, the gigantic, colossal storefront paintings. That was back in Soho after we closed the East Village Gallery. So here we are, we're at 10th and B, not 11 blocks from where this painting takes place. At 10th and B, we mounted a show, and this was one of, about 10 paintings in the exhibition. Other notables were down for the count. Just some real ringers there.
Yeah.
So Martin brought it in, we hung it, and as in most of his works, even though I was an art dealer and my main function at that time was to sell the work, being an art historian with a master's degree and having studied Renaissance art, among other things, I was really interested in parsing these things out, but not as interested as I am now when I no longer have to sell paintings.
Right.
Anyway, Martin, like most artists and his contemporaries, whether it be Jean-Michel Basquiat or Keith Haring, he had a vocabulary of images that he constantly recycled from painting to painting. In other words, the hand signs appear in all the paintings, just about.
But curiously not in this painting. I was looking for the hand signs everywhere and I couldn't find them. So that's odd, isn't it?
No, they're not, and nor are there any astrological signs or constellations, because the constellations are the images of the revolver, which is a snub-nosed, one of the smallest revolvers that's available, and the 32. And, you can easily conceal it, so it's great for a criminal, and that has a lot to do with this painting. Then there's the 8-ball, the heart from which the bullet, which is shot schematically from the revolver, is bouncing off. And a beer can. Notice that the beer can is just generic beer. It's not Bud or Schlitz or anything like that. It's just beer. It's all schematics. And then there's a screwdriver, which nobody ever mentions, but I'm going to. And then at the very right, cut is a double-edged razor blade. And I'll go through all these symbols because it'll be delightful. Okay, so we showed the painting. During the show, it was bought by a collector who bought not only this painting, but a painting called Down for the Count, itself a mystery of poetic import. So both bought 2 paintings. One is now in a museum, And this one was until yesterday in a private collection, and now it's in another private collection.
Right.
And I have no idea where that collection is. And thank God the sale even went on, considering all the cyber hacking.
Yes, we've heard all about Christie's problems with their website. But before we just go into the iconography a bit more, I just want to talk about the fact that there is a portrait of Mikey Piñero at the bottom of the picture, and he's holding a piece of paper. And so one assumes that, as you say, he's reciting the poem which Martin Wong writes around the edge of the canvas. Can you say something about that poem? Because it's hugely important in terms of his identity and his connection with Martin.
Absolutely. There's a Renaissance term, poesia pintura, which is basically painting the poem. And it was a link during the Renaissance, which was very important because you had Neoplatonism and then you had artists like Botticelli and Michelangelo and Leonardo. So what's going on here is that, among other things, Martin is depicting in his own imaginary way a Lower East Side poem.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of a visual transcription. So yes, the painting is referring to itself, and it is a direct reference to Piñero, who's standing on a rooftop at Ridge and Stanton. Well, Martin lived at the corner of Ridge and Stanton, which is below Houston, not 5 blocks from where I lived. So we were neighbors. Now, Piñero, as he's situated, I found out later, I had no idea that Martin was using photographs to help him do these paintings. And again, the paintings are really recollections of buildings that many of which are no longer with us. This building happens to yet be standing. It's been posited by the few people that even analyzed this painting that he's standing across the street. As far as I can tell, though, the 6-story building behind Piñero, Martin's building at the corner of Ridge and Stanton, was 6 floors. And believe me, I walked up them many times, so I can tell you.
Yeah.
So I would like to think that that's Martin's building itself,
right,
with the gold illuminating it, which reminds me of Giotto and all the people that were using gold leaf to sanctify the area that they're addressing. So, as I said, Martin Wong was a very complex, multifaceted, multivalent, almost polymathic character. No, he didn't do nuclear science or anything like that. But in terms of, he was a linguist and, in a sense, a philosopher, only in the folk sense.
So basically, Mikey Piñero was a key figure in this New Yorico scene of poets and so on. And the style of these poems is really hip-hoppy, right? So it really taps into this incredibly urban language and this depiction of life in the city.
Absolutely. And Martin was fascinated by the idea of twins. You have the twin firemen, you have twin towers. He and Piñero were both born in 1946, Martin in July and Piñero in December. So it was fated that these two would meet. They were both characters, exuberant, exhilarated, but at the same time, they had criminal minds. Martin was never in jail, except maybe for being busted for being a naked marauder in the Angels of Light in San Francisco. But Piñero spent his youth in jail.
And indeed, Martin pictures him in jail in several amazing pictures, right?
Absolutely. There are several paintings of Piñero. I did note when I was talking to Christie's that when they called me for a quote, I said that this is only one of 2 paintings that have a near complete. It's not the whole poem, because I've looked around the frame. And it goes around all 4 sides. It starts at the lower left. This is incredible in that it has more of this Lower East Side poem than all the other paintings have of their poems. The painting in the Met, which is probably the most important Piñero painting, has, I believe, either almost an entire poem or an entire poem.
Do you think he's trying to illustrate the poem at all? Obviously, around the edge of the painting, as I say, he's written the words literally. But do you think some of these symbols are actually trying to illustrate the themes of the poem? Or do you think this is more about his feelings for Mikey Piñero? In other words, is this a sort of paean to a lost love? Or is it a kind of attempt to describe a figure and a general scene in that part of New York?
Well, first of all, it was a complicated relationship. They were lovers. They met at the crime show. And this was at ABC No Rio, which was across the street from my place next to a matzo factory, 5 blocks away from Martin. Martin had exhibited 2 paintings. One was Son of Sam Sleeps, and the other one was something like, it was about, the Son of Sam murders. and it came from the World Weekly News. Martin, grabbed headlines when he was in the subway. So they met at the crime show. According to Martin, they walked around all night, all over New York. And Martin was a recent arrival. He arrived in New York in 1978, but he just started living in the Lower East Side in 1982, moving into this building on Ridge and Stanton. So Piñero familiarized him with the whole graffiti scene, which is why the hip hop is involved, because Piñero was a kind of traveling in the company of these young graffiti artists, some of whom, I don't want to disparage them, had a delinquent nature. The whole idea of crime and love and happiness are intertwined in this whole thing. So is Martin illustrating the poem with these symbols? Well, first of all, they're universal symbols in Martin's work. Yeah. Secondly, yes, they do relate to the poem because Martin was fascinated with crime, and it appears in a lot of his work. He did later, he wouldn't even show me these, but he hid from me paintings that he had done, explicit paintings, very explicit paintings of people in jail. They were small, they were the prison series. Martin talked all the time, yet he was cagey, and he only told you what he wanted you to know, which was mostly gossip about his graffiti friends.
Right.
The important things like symbolism and where these things came from, that was never disclosed. So The 8-ball, the revolver, the bullet, the brick heart, the beer, the screwdriver, and the razor blade are all associated one way or another with crime and prison. The screwdriver, as far as I think, besides being a weapon, is what's used to pry open windows. Right. I actually had to climb that fire escape to get to Martin's paintings one night after he had given many away and ended up in Bellevue. So I know that fire escape well. When I was in there, somebody pointed a gun at me. You might have heard that story.
Yeah, obviously we can't go into it in depth, but basically he had taken LSD and then had an episode, and then you had to try and retrieve these paintings that he'd given away because you had a show organised, right?
That's right. It was just a couple days before the show. Martin was in Bellevue, and it was an adventure. Right. I had to get the paintings on the street, and then I had to actually break into his apartment to get the rest, and I was almost arrested myself. So anyway, the screwdriver is used to open a window. Sorry for my digression.
It's all good.
Digression is my middle name. And so the beer, well, beer is for celebration, and, beer also gets you in trouble. So the double-edged razor is easy to conceal. You can slit somebody's arm with it. You can cut their face. The other thing is razor blades, single-edged razor blades, are used to cut cocaine. Now, interestingly enough, get this, the 8-ball. Now, you probably think what's the most common association would be behind the 8. The second would be the magic 8, which is that ball that we all had when we were kids, where you just kind of hold it and it tells you what you should do. Yeah. Ask me later.
It was a fortune teller.
It was. Yeah. It's a fortune teller, which is what the astrology is about. And it's all about fortune and fate, because the poem itself is a celebration of the exhilaration, don't take me anywhere else, bury my ashes on the Lower East Side. That's where I want to be. And that's actually what they did with his ashes, as a matter of fact. So the 8-ball represents good luck or really bad luck, born under a bad sign, behind the 8. It refers to, because, when the 8-ball goes in, it's over.
It's all over, yeah.
Also, 8-ball, I don't know if you've seen this, but it's a common tattoo as well.
Right.
Also, just dealing with the idea of gambling, luck, chance. But here's something that I don't think anybody has ever disclosed before. 8-ball refers to 1/8 of an ounce of cocaine. And believe me, if it wasn't intended, it's one of these things that's just in there by some kind of synchronistic displacement. So here we are. These symbols, people look at them, oh yeah, that's what they are. No, each one has an important meaning. So how do they relate to Piñero? Well, Piñero spent so much time in jail. That's where he wrote Short Eyes, the play that established Piñero as an important figure in the theater, which has to do with this white prisoner who's transferred to Rikers with Black and Latino prisoners. And there's a lot of trouble because Short Eyes, when you're a child convicted for child molestation, you're going to get it bad from everybody that's there. And the play was quite sensational, later became a movie, as you know. So Miguel Piñero introduced Martin to the whole idea of the life of the prison, something he was interested in anyway. But boy, he became conversant in it. And, well, they were roommates. They were briefly lovers. They weren't lovers for a long time. Martin collected roommates. Piñero would steal and contribute to Martin's rent, as a matter of fact, so Martin could start painting. Lee Quinones lived with Martin, very renowned graffiti artist. My friend Sam lived with him. My friend Teresa lived with him. I mean, he collected people.
And lastly, like so much of Martin's work, this painting is both impossibly romantic and at the same time apocalyptic. It contains multitudes. And I think that's one of the key factors in the fact that we want to return to these paintings. And I'm sure that's the way that you feel about this one so many years later.
Absolutely. I've seen this painting maybe 5 times since it was bought. One at a museum, the other one we did as retrospective, another retrospective, and now visually at the auction. Yeah, well, the fiery sky, really, as far as I'm concerned, refers to the fires that were constantly going on the Lower East Side when landlords were setting their own buildings on fire to collect on the insurance. So that's a factor too, but in the other sense, it's an illuminated sky. There's the good, there's the evil, there's the up, there's the down. And yes, I mean, it does show love for Piñero. These kind of twins, these, what do we call it, doppelgangers or something. And the whole idea of a doppelganger is one is good and the other is evil. I'm not saying that in this case that is necessarily true, but it's joy and anguish.
It is indeed an extraordinary painting. Barry, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
You can read all our reports on the New York auctions on the website and the app. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, @TanAudio, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. The Week in Art is produced by Julie Michalska, Alexander Morrison, and David Clack, and David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, Tabitha, Jessica, and Barry. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.